Started the recording.
Want to,
I don't know
but
if it's doing
it
it.
goes a long, long way. and
Yeah,
you'll
see the
take
two red color buttons at the bottom?
Yeah.
You see, the one on the left is record, the one on the right
It
straight.
was, it
And I
was,
see the green
But
But
button
with that
bouncing, so
stone
he
water that was
must be
there, I
having
don't know if that'd
voice
help.
on.
Yep.
But it would help the information and help.
yeah, that is information, because like it's inflamed when that little calcified cartilage is, gets in between the thingy and that explains, I probably had to change what he says, but I just worked now, every time my knee would act funny, just, I explained what it is, and so, the only way I had to have surgery is that they pulled my, to get that out, but it's about this far behind my knee.
It tore all
This
the
is
brick
behind
off
my
the
knee, I'm
house
trying
today
to, that
and
would really
left.
lock out, so.
And then the rain came.
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, I just got on this walls and everything. Keep fixing down. At least it's some of them, I don't know about all of them, but you know.
But that is progress. They
Yes.
gotta have a pour off before they can fix it.
Yes, they do.
And this afternoon,
So they're making progress.
Yeah,
As long as they waterproofed it before they left.
they did.
Uh-oh.
Hey
Yeah.
Ron, did you notice all the batteries I got here for you when you forget?
No, I didn't notice they were there.
Yeah, I got all
I
kinds
think there's some too.
Have I been sideways
Well,
or
that's
south
right.
or west? I think you do all right.
Smells the milk.
How far was the house that
I
exploded
imagine
from
Tony probably
JP?
you're allergic to it, so I can't.
A month ago, I used.
Yeah, they've been seeing pretty good,
How
huh?
far was the exploding house from JP?
Just a few houses over.
Well, let's see.
It's closer to the mall.
It would be closer to where Ron and
Oh,
Carla.
it's stinky
Well,
stuff again, he says.
hey Ron, did you
Also
have any
works.
damage from that house that
I'm
exploded?
telling you to play the other
Hey,
one too.
John,
I think we were maybe two.
it's
and a
where
half.
It was based on
Jay
flower.
That's the thing, something he made.
Are you that
It was
far?
flowers.
It's just a few houses down where they used to live, where their mom lives now, her mom.
It's a tree, tea
Yeah.
tree.
So it's more closer to her mom's house than hers.
Yeah.
Oh, they're by the Votech?
Anything floral.
Oh, I thought it was on the
No, that's what she put on
McCarthy side of
Facebook.
Rockwell.
It's off.
No, that's what she put on
up by
Facebook.
council.
It's on the council side.
One
I thought I
twenty
seen
second.
that
Well, the
stuff
news
that
kept
I
saying
see, I
1.2
couldn't
in
find it,
Rockwell.
so.
Yep, that's what the news says.
I
I
thought
got
they
one
were.
of those, you but look at that.
That's why the only one I can think of at
He
122nd
said
in
from now on I'll
Rockwell
probably take the 2 Tylenol.
would be either,
I mean, the 2 ibuprofen before I go to bed.
Little Danny
Continually, but.
or JP.
Yeah, no, it's a little further out.
Yeah, it was
Another
their,
mile
next
out.
to their old house.
Cause it's over at council.
Oh, that's close to Ron's house.
Yeah.
Knock your windows out.
No, he said about 3 miles away.
Yeah, 2.5, 3, because I was standing on the north side of 122nd Street, and see, we're halfway down, at least 2 miles anyway. Did you hear it? It's 2 miles away.
So you
Did you hear it blow up?
opened a lot
Huh?
of stuff
Did you
then.
hear it blow
Well,
up?
that
No,
one and that
because,
one you grabbed
we weren't
out.
home that, we didn't get home till later that Saturday afternoon, was it Saturday morning?
Did she even know they were hers?
3 a.m. or
I don't
something
think
like
it's
that.
on.
I wouldn't hear it anyway.
I feel like it's wet.
Happy next door for him.
I
Big drops.
just started out an hour early.
But anyway.
Alright, it's time to begin. Mic on here, just in case somebody at home wants to listen. Maxine's still at home, still got her leg elevated. The blood clot is still huge.
No,
Doctor
it's gone
won't.
down, it's gone down.
It's still huge though,
I don't
isn't
know
it?
about that, but I talked to her today, she told me that the knot has actually gone down.
Well,
But
good.
she still has to keep it elevated for a while, because she's on a lot of meds.
They put her on a diuretic, hoping that'll help. And Sharon's still puny. And other than that, I can't think of
Betty's
anything.
home.
Betty is home. Yeah,
Betty's
Beth Arnhart
home,
is
but
still
she-
sick.
She can't talk, I mean, she's just,
I talked to her today, she sounded a lot better than she did
No.
the other day.
Good,
don't
good.
talk.
Oh, I was gonna go
So other than that, I don't know of anybody
Well,
else.
she probably would have visited anyway.
Yeah, she's home, but she's.
Kathy may be with her mother tonight, I don't know. Jetson, you want to lead us in prayer?
Our Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for all your many wonderful blessings. We thank you for allowing us this opportunity to gather here this evening to study another portion of your word. Please be with those who are mentioned and be with them and help them recover from their ailments so that they could return to us and be with us in the studies and worship services again. Please be with us and have us have open minds and open hearts, and that we can apply what we learn and become better servants to you. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Well, I had a good day today. I spent 2 hours visiting with the preacher from Deer Creek Church of Christ. And we've been working with him for about 5 years.
That's the one on Edmond Road, just the other side of MacArthur.
Uh-huh. They, when he started preaching there, they had about 20 members. Now they're up to about 150 members.
Wow.
And he said, surprisingly, there's a lot of people over there that has visited Seminole Point. Some of them more than a few times. And said not one of them has any bad thing to say about Seminole Point. And he said if Deer Creek was non-existent, he'd be coming over here. So he's just about that far now. That congregation is about that far from being non-institutional. So they don't believe in supporting orphanages or colleges or anything like that. They still eat in the building. And but other than that, they're pretty conservative. And had a good visit. His attitude is much better today than it was 5 years ago when I first talked to him.
So do they
5
have a
years ago,
kitchen, like,
Huh?
do they have a kitchen in their building too?
Well, that's there's a family that used to go here at Broadview Heights, I think, and he told me the guy's name. I can't remember his name, and it's not important anyway. But I guess the guy was pretty well off. He's very conservative, except for one thing, and that was that he liked a fellowship hall in the congregation. So the elders there sat down with him and they agreed to put a stove in the building. But he said, our kitchen is no bigger than the desk in the elder's office. He said, all it's got is a refrigerator and a stove in there, and all you can do is turn around. He said, but that satisfied him, and he continued to give his money there. So, but he's come a long ways. We're in the 9th chapter of 1 Corinthians, beginning with verse 15. In the 9th chapter, you remember verses 1 through 11, and actually it goes through chapter 2. Galatians chapter 1, verse 11, through Galatians chapter 2, verse 21. Excuse me, is kind of a comparison in the sense that Paul vindicates his apostleship. And that's what he's doing here in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And we began at verse 7, where he talked about the fact that those who preach the gospel are to live by means of the gospel. And of course, the week before last, this was a discussion we had about the fact that preachers are deserving of a decent salary because they should be expected to live comfortably and not have to rely on food stamps or anything like that. So now what we're going to talk about is in verses 15 through 18, Paul is waiving his rights for the gospel's sake. And we kind of alluded to this last week, is the fact that he didn't accept any funds from the congregation there at Corinth because he did not want to be obligated to them for anything other than preaching the gospel. And I'll put it that way. So let's read verses 15 through 18. Jensen, why don't we begin with you tonight?
But I have,
Go ahead.
but I have used none of these things, nor have I written these things, that it should be done so to me. For it would be better for me to die than to have that anyone should make my boasting void. For if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of. For necessity is laid upon me. Yes, woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this willingly, I have a reward. But if against my will, I have been entrusted with a stewardship. What is my reward then? That when I preach the gospel, I may present the gospel of Christ without charge, that I may not abuse my authority in the gospel.
Okay.
Let me ask you a question.
Yes, Gene.
Who was it now that Paul said that they had sent time and again to his needs in Macedonia?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yeah. And we'll look at that a little bit later too. And he also mentioned it here as well. In fact, well, I'm not finding it now, but we'll talk about it a little bit more as we get on.
Mine, I couldn't remember.
But yeah, no, you're right. There were other congregations that supported him so that he didn't have to take anything from Corinth. And also he used his own occupation too. What was his occupation? He was a tent maker, exactly right.
Priscilla and Aquila.
Uh,
That we made tent with was Priscilla
Mhm.
and Aquila.
yeah. And I mean, he may have made some with someone else too, but we know he made tents with them because they were tent makers as well. But if you look at verse 15 and everything, you see this phrase here, but I use none of these things. Another way of saying it is, I have foregone my rights. The whole point of this chapter is his abstinence from using his rights, and the lesson to the Corinthians that they ought to do likewise. In other words, give up their rights out of love for their weak brethren. And remember, this is one of the contentions we talked about in chapter 8, in verse 11. And because of your knowledge shall the weak brother perish, for whom Christ died. But when you thus sin against the brethren and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never again eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. And this is the point that he's trying to make here, is that they should be willing to give up rights that they feel comfortable with if it's going to cause someone to stumble for the sake of the weak brethren. And then we look at verse 16 there, and he says the point that he's making there is preaching the gospel is his duty. It's his obligation. And this is the attitude that every preacher, every sincere preacher of the gospel should in some measure feel this necessity if they're going to be a God-fearing preacher, one that preaches the truth. In fact, preachers should not think of the work as a position of honor, but as a work for the Lord. And I should put that. Well, what'd you do, John? Did you mess it up?
Blame the computer.
I probably would if I knew how, but I don't know how.
Well, okay. So the point is, preachers should not think of the work as a position of honor, but as a work for the Lord. Why? By His grace and underserved mercy, underserved mercy has provided the means of salvation. As God has blessed him with the ability and opportunity, even so is his responsibility. John and I met an hour with our Brotherhood Mutual, which is the company that insures the building here. And he kept referring to different religions around the areas, the problems that they're having, and the lawsuits that they're having because of some of the social things that they're doing. And he kept talking about the pasture. Of course, I didn't say anything because I didn't think it was going to change anything. But this is our society. Is a lot of people look at the preacher as being the head, the most important individual. And so he kept talking about the lawsuits that was being placed upon them. One down in Del City, I guess even the Acts 2 over here has got some legal problems that he was talking about, and a few other religions as well.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, that happened to the congregation in Hawaii, on Oahu, the Waipahu congregation. They were very conservative and they needed a new preacher.
Uh-huh.
And they hired this new preacher, this young guy, and he didn't realize he had ties with this other, like, really liberal congregation. And then he started slowly, like wolf in sheep's clothing, right? And then he started getting more and more liberal, and he started bringing all these other things in. And the members said, no, you can't do that, right? Then he called the police on them, and then the police kicked the members out, saying that he had all the rights because he was the so-called pastor of the congregation. So, and he took over the building. He took the building away from them.
I've heard of that happening too.
Yeah. So
Turn your Bibles to Matthew, the 25th chapter. And let's look at these verses 14 through 30 for just a minute. Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30. And if I get turned over there. What we see there in Matthew 25, beginning in verse 14, is the parable of the talents. And recognizing exactly what God expects. This is a little longer reading, but let's go ahead and read it. Pat, would you read verses 14 through 16? And then Debbie, if you'd read verses 17 through 20. And we'll stop there for a moment.
For the kingdom of heaven is like a man traveling to a far country, who called his own servants and delivered his goods to them. And to one he gave 5 talents, and to another 2, and to another 1, and to each according to his own ability. And immediately he went on a journey. Then he who had received the 5 talents went and traded with them, and made another 5 talents.
And likewise he who had received 2 gained 2 more also. But he who had received 1 went and dug in the ground and hid his Lord's money. After a long time the Lord of those servants came and settled accounts with them. So he who had received 5 talents came and brought 5 other talents, saying, Lord, you delivered to me 5 talents. Look, I have gained 5 more talents besides them.
Okay. Now, we know the rest of that parable and everything. What happened to the 1 talent man?
He lost the one he had.
He lost the one he had. And yet he had a talent. He was given something, but he didn't use what he was given. Those who was given more, they did in fact use what they were given, and they grew as a result of it. And I liken that to members in the church and everything. When we become newborn babes in Christ, oftentimes we only have 1 talent. And we can go throughout our whole life in service to the Lord with just that 1 talent. But what happens is we don't grow. And when we don't grow, we're going to have to pay for our lack of spiritual growth. And this is kind of what happened to this individual. And the idea is that as God has blessed the preacher with ability and opportunity, that is the preacher's responsibility. And we can also liken that to Christians. As God has blessed me, as He's blessed you, we have a responsibility to utilize that which God, the God-given abilities. And Paul should realize that he is not undertaking a job by which to get rich, as some secular fields may offer. But preaching is his life, for which he is worthy only for a living wage. And good preachers, they're content with that. There's been times John has actually said, I didn't expect to get a salary increase this year, because he understands the economy. He understands what's going on in the congregation. And for example, this year, we're going to give him a small increase, but it's very small. And yet we recognize that people who are on Social Security and federal retirement gets no salary increase for 2016. In fact, some of them are actually going to pay more in 2016. I was telling John that Florence and I will pay at $200 a month more this year because of medical.
Yeah, that's what I figured.
It's terrible getting old. They want more money from us old folks.
Better than the alternative.
Well, that's true. Well, I don't know.
Maybe,
I don't know
I'm
about
starting
that,
to
John.
Better for the
But you
people
have no
around.
say.
There you go. Man, you almost caught me on that one, John. All right, so let's look at verse 17 then. In verse 17 again, he says, For if I do this willingly, I have a reward. But if against my will, I have been entrusted with a stewardship. Paul had been entrusted indeed with a stewardship of the gospel, and he was to preach to the Gentiles. Let's go to Acts, the 26th chapter. And Donna, let's look at verses 16 through 18, if you would.
But get up and stand on your feet. For this purpose I have appeared to you, to appoint you a minister and a witness not only to the things which you have seen, but also to the things in which I will appear to you, rescuing you from the Jewish people and from the Gentiles, to whom I am sending you, to open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light and from dominion of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those who have been sanctified by faith in me.
Okay. So then in verse 18 he says, What is my reward then? That when I preach the gospel, I may present the gospel of Christ without charge, that I may not abuse my authority in the gospel. The idea is that Paul gladly, oops, maybe I didn't put that up there. I guess I didn't. Paul gladly accepted his duties as an apostle and as an evangelist because he had the joy that was needed to preach the gospel without charge. Was a reward to him. None could say he was preaching for the money, nor because he had to preach in order to obey God. He did it because he wanted to do it. He did it because he loved God and he was willing to do it. I've oftentimes said that if I wanted to become a multi-millionaire, I'd start my own religion. If Joel Osteen, or what's his name? Osteen, if he can do it, if I can't even think of some of the others now. Oral Roberts, if he can do it.
Baker.
Who?
Baker.
Baker. Yeah, if he can do it. If his wife can do it. Yes. Certainly if she can do it, I can do it and become a multimillionaire. What was the first Christian preacher's name in Missouri that last I heard he was caught on the lake with a giant-sized boat that he had got from all the funds from his evangelism. And that's the attitude. I would venture to say that the preacher over here at the Life Church probably is driving around in the most fancy car that you could imagine and has the nicest house in the neighborhood and is doing quite well for himself because he started all that. And this is the attitude that some folks have. But Paul didn't have that attitude. Paul's attitude was, hey, this is a joy for me. I'm doing this because I love God and because I want to do it, not because I'm trying to become wealthy or because I have to do it. Any comments through verse 18? All right, let's look at the next section here then. This is actually verses 19 through 23. And the point that Paul is making here is that he's looking at the method and reward of a true ministry. And he actually makes the point that he became all things to all men. So let's read, Florence, if you would, read 19 through 23.
For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. And to the Jews I became a Jew, that I might win Jews. So those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without law. Did I not read far enough?
23.
Through 23.
Two more.
Oh. To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be partaker of it with you.
All right, thank you. I thought maybe you were just catching your breath for a minute. So the point that Paul's making here in verse 19 is that he gladly accepted his duties as an apostle, as an evangelist, obviously, and while Paul's refusal of financial support freed him from any scruples, any individual in the congregation that might question his purpose and might question him to the extent that it might hinder his work, he allowed himself, on the other hand, to be restricted by their customs and by their opinions. He became their servant that he might gain their confidence to hear the gospel that he preached. And when I say that he allowed himself to be restricted by their customs and opinions, this is not to say that Paul yielded to some unscriptural practices just to win them over. Because this was not Paul. He
didn't just pour mouth.
No, he did not. And we'll see that as we go on here. But I wanted to make sure that everybody understood that. And then we look at verses 20 and 21, and the point that he's making here, he says, and to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under law. To those who are without the law, as without the law, not being without the law toward God, but under law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without the law. So to the Jew, he conducted himself as a Jew, observing the law so long as he could do so without interfering with his duty to God. Let's go to Acts the 16th chapter and look at Acts 16 and verse 3. John.
Whom would Paul have to go forth with him, and took and circumcised him because of the Jews which were in those quarters, for they all knew his father was a Greek.
Okay. Now let's go over to Acts the 21st chapter, Stephanie, and read verses 20 through 26.
And when they heard it, they glorified the Lord, and they said to him, You see, brother, how many myriads of Jews there are who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. But they have been informed about you, that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, nor to walk according to the customs. What then? The assembly must certainly meet, for they will hear that you have come. Therefore do what we tell you. We have 4 men we have taken a vow. Take them and be purified with them, and pay their expenses, so that they may shave their heads, and that all may know that those things of which they were informed concerning you are nothing, but that you yourselves also walk orderly and keep the law. But concerning the Gentiles who believe, we have written and decided that they should observe no such thing, except that they should keep themselves from things offered to idols, from blood, from things strangled, and from sexual immorality.
And the idea that Paul is presenting here, obviously, is that they didn't shave their heads. They didn't do those things because they believed that that was what they had to do to be saved, but they did it so that they would remove any reservations by the people they were trying to teach. And because what they did wasn't interfering with their duty to God, it was just doing it so that they could sit down and study with those individuals, and those individuals would have an open mind. Paul did the same thing with the Gentiles, because those were individuals who were not under the Mosaic law. He became just as one of the Gentiles and did not require them to accept the Jewish ceremonial law. However, he was never without law to God, but was always under law to Christ. And that's what verses 20 and 21 say. You remember the Apostle Paul had to chastise another apostle for a specific reason. You remember what that was?
He chastised Peter.
He chastised Peter. Why did he chastise Peter?
Because when the Jews from Jerusalem came around, he withdrew from the Gentiles.
Yeah. He was kind of two-faced in what he was doing, but Peter was human, just like you and I are human. We make mistakes and everything, and when Paul brought it to his attention, I believe that Peter made a tremendous change in his life and recognized that this was not the will of God, what he was doing, and so he made a change so that he was doing the will of God. We look at verses 22 and 23 then, and the point that he's making here is, as you see, he says, To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be partaker of it with you. Think about this for a minute, because he's saying to the spiritually weak, like the one described, go back to the 8th chapter and look at verse 7. 8th chapter and verse 7. He says, There is not in every one that knowledge, for some with consciousness of the idol until now eat it as a thing offered to an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. The idea is that Paul gave up his rights in order to save them. You go down to verse 13 of chapter 8, and he says, Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never again eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. He meant only that in matters of liberty, that he waived his rights in order to influence others to obey the gospel and be saved. He did not and would not violate God's commandments. And so in no way in these verses is he suggesting that we should do something to violate God's commandments in order to win someone else. in fact, if you think about that, to violate God's commandments, trying to teach someone would only teach them that it's okay to violate God's commandments. And this is not what Paul was doing. You and I today could look at this same attitude that Paul has here and everything. If I was going to study with someone that I knew was a poor family, that the best attire they had was nothing more than coveralls and maybe a t-shirt, I'm not going to come to their house and try to study with them in a suit and a tie. Because they would be very uncomfortable if I did that. I'm not going to come in shorts, but I would dress casually so that I might not violate their conscience in any way, and they would be more open-minded to study. And I may not be the best example in the world, but this is the attitude that Paul had. Is he's not going to do anything that would cause someone not to be open-minded in studying the Scriptures. Any comments or questions through verse 23?
Kind of reading all this, you have to be aware of who you're teaching and what their background is and what their beliefs are.
Exactly right. Exactly right. In fact, of course, Cody, he's been coming back, and I knew he wanted to talk to me Sunday morning, and he came over to me and he said, are we still going to study together? Because, I was doing the new converts class with him and with his wife, Laura. And I said, yeah, Cody, I said, I'll be glad to sit down with you and study if that's what you'd like to do, or you're welcome to go to the auditorium class or come back here, either one. No, I'd like to study. And so we talked quite a bit and everything, and I just let him talk a lot, because there's a lot of things on his mind and everything, a lot of problems, but he's coming around. And towards the end there, I told him, I said, Cody, I said, I'm not telling you what to do. But I says, you've acknowledged that your not being here was a sin. But you didn't sin against God any more than you sinned against the brethren here at this congregation. And I said, you ought to make it right with the brethren here. And I said, I promise you, if you do that, the brethren's not going to question you. He said, well, I'll be glad to answer any questions of what's going on in my life. I said, no. Then not one brethren here will come up to you and ask you what's been going on in your life. They'll all welcome you with open arms if you are genuine in your repentance. And so his decision was to go forward Sunday morning. And so I asked him Sunday night, I said, Cody, I said, was I true in what I said? He says, help me out. I'm a little fuzzy because he works at night, and so he's worn out. And he says, remember I mentioned to you that if you decide to go forward and repent, that the brethren would come up to you and welcome you and let you know that you're in their prayers? He said, they sure did. And that's the attitude we have to have. So we look at verses 24 and 25 then. And in 24 and 25, Paul is talking about the fact that self-denial is a small price to gain an incorruptible crown. So let's see here. Isaac, read verses 24 and 25 for me, please.
Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown.
Okay. Now let's go ahead and read verses 26 and 27 also. Ron, would you read that for me, please?
Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty, thus I fight, not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I preach to others, I myself should become disqualified.
Okay. So we look at verse 26 and we see the difference between the Christian's race and, well, let me go back a little bit first. Let's go back to verse 24. He says, do you not know that those who run in a race all run? Every 2 years, the Isthmian Games took place. And these games were named for the isthmus on which Corinth stood. Only free men could enter, and all the athletes would prepare by intense training for several months. today you might compare the training that takes forth for people who run a marathon. Some people run a half marathon, which is 13 miles. A marathon is 26 miles. And then you had the Ironman. They ride a bicycle, they run, and they swim. That takes intense training, and that's what these folks were doing. They would train for several months, and the runners in those races trained to do their very best. This comes out of McGuigan's book on page 131. So what Paul is doing here, he pictured the Christian life in a figure as a race drawn from these Greek games that these people understood. Remember, this is in Corinth. This is where these games were taking place, some of them. And two significant points were made. First, the point that he's making is entering is not enough, because only one must win the race to gain the prize. And the old saying is, the person who comes in second is the first loser. The second thing we learn is that the reward was a corruptible crown. They spent all of these months training for something that was corruptible, something that would perish. And then we look at verse 25. He says, and everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. The training and preparation required self-denial. Think about these athletes. We know these now. Our basketball players, which Thunder will be playing a game tonight. They'll probably lose again, but they'll play. Well,
Never lose.
you know, what's his name's not going to be playing tonight.
I
Kevin.
know that. They said Kevin
Hurt his
might.
toe.
He might, but then we're going to lose our best defender because he sprained his ankle the other night. But the point is, think about, huh?
His big toe.
No, that's KD.
Well, that was
No,
Kevin
that's
Durant.
KD.
That's KD.
One thing on this example, one thing we can try to draw from it is, we all run the race, but only one can win.
Right.
And with our race for salvation, all win.
That's true, and we're going to make that point. So just hang with me, because you're right. The point is that I'm making with these athletes is they go through a special diet. Every sports team has a trainer, special training. Even our college sports teams, OU football. And some of these trainers are paid more than some of the coaches because they do such an outstanding job of preparing these athletes, both diet and both physical conditioning, so that they might win the race. But that certainly is not the most important thing. Those who would strive for the crown would gladly and willingly give up their rights to enter the race. And I'm talking about the physical race here that Paul is talking about, okay? So we look at the self-denial then in verses 26 and 27 that Ron read there. And the difference in the Christian's race is everyone who enters can win. That's the difference in the secular race and the Christian race. Everyone who enters can win. And the reward is an incorruptible crown. Look at 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 4. Jensen, we're back to you.
To an inheritance incorruptible and undefiled, and that does not fade away, reserved in heaven for you.
Okay. One must not imagine that the race for a Christian is a life of easy indifference because we are in a fight with the devil. Paul made this clear when he was talking to the church at Ephesus in Ephesians the 6th chapter and verses 10 through 18. We'll not read all of that, Pat. If you'll read, just read 10 through 14 if you would.
Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of dark places of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in heavenly places. And therefore take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day. And having done all this, stand. Therefore, having your waist girded about with truth, put on the breastplate of righteousness. I think that's all you said.
Yeah, that's good enough. The idea, and what he says, put on the whole gospel armor. In other words, prepare yourself for this race. To win this race, we must be totally committed to become a living sacrifice for Christ. Look at what Paul said to the church at Rome in Romans, the 12th chapter, verses 1 and 2, Debbie.
I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God.
Okay. Then we see what the Hebrew writer said in Hebrews 12, verses 1 through 3.
Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us. And let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who, for the joy set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart.
Okay. So the idea that the Hebrew writer is bringing out, and Paul is bringing out to the church at Rome and also to the church at Ephesus and here to the Corinthian brethren, is unlike the athlete who does all this training and everything, knowing full well that only one of them is going to win the race. The rest is all going to come in behind the one person. However, you and I can joyfully put forth a strenuous effort because we have assurance of victory. Every Christian can win. Look at what John said in 1 John chapter 5 and verse 13. Florence?
These things I have written to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, that you may know that you have eternal life, and that you may continue to believe in the name of the Son of God.
Okay. And so he concludes verse 26 is not as one who beats the air. We as Christians do not simply beat the air. The implication here is, and we used, John mentioned this yesterday morning in our Bible class here, think of a boxer. We've all seen people on television or even in movies. If you've watched those movies by Sylvester Stallone and everything, in his training for boxing, they did a lot of what they call shadow boxing. They weren't really hitting anything, but there was a purpose for doing that, because a boxer must learn to be able to duck and move to the side. And they'll throw a lot of fists that will not necessarily hit the opponent, but will cause the opponent to move in such a way that maybe the next thrust will hit their target. So they train in this way. But we do not shadow box. We do not miss the mark. We are on target. And in verse 27 he says, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. And the idea is, he concludes by speaking of his own efforts to win this race. He disciplined himself and brought himself into subjection by resisting the temptations that, if subdued, might lead to spiritual defeat and thereby lose the crown. Every Christian must take heed lest we turn our hearts away in unbelief and also lose the crown. Look at what he said to the Corinthian brethren in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 12. Isaac, read that for me, please.
Therefore let him who thinks he stand take heed lest he fall.
Okay. And Ron, would you read Hebrews 3:12 through 19 for me, please?
Beware, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. But exhort one another daily while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened to the deceitfulness of sin. For we become partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end. While it is said today, if you'll hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. For who having heard rebelled? Indeed, was it not all who came out of Egypt led by Moses? Now with whom was he angry 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose corpses fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but to those who did not obey? So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief.
Okay. The Hebrew writer here is bringing to our attention what we already know that took place in the Old Testament. When we had the children of Israel here who was in bondage in Egypt. They were led out of bondage and everything, but they very quickly turned their attention away from God. And they started doing other things, and as a result, they suffered consequences because of it. You remember the fiery serpent that was put on the pole, and all they had to do is turn and look on that. It wasn't the fiery serpent that saved them. It was the belief, the faith that saved them. Same thing that Paul's making here. You remember that the 12 spies went into the land of Canaan. 2 came back with a favorable report. 10 came back with an unfavorable report because they didn't have faith. He goes on in chapter 4 of Hebrews, and I'll read this, verses 1 through 11. He talks about the better rest for the believer. He says, therefore, since a promise remains of entering his rest, let us fear lest any of you seem to have come short of it. For indeed the gospel was preached to us as well as to them, but the word which they heard did not profit them, nor being mixed with faith in those who heard it. For we who have believed do enter that rest, as he has said, so I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest, although the works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he has spoken in a certain place of the Sabbath day in his way. And God rested on the seventh day from his works. And again in his place they shall not enter my rest. Since therefore it remains that some must enter it, and those to whom it was first preached did not enter because of disobedience. Again he designates a certain day, saying in David, today, after such a long time as it has been said, today if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, then he would not afterward had spoken of another day. There remains therefore a rest for the people of God, for he who has entered his rest has himself also ceased from his works as God did from his. Let us therefore be diligent to enter that rest, lest anyone fall according to the same example of disobedience. And that's the lesson that Paul is presenting to the Corinth brethren here. Yes?
Translation are you reading?
New King James.
Mine is King James, and it's verse 8 it says that if Jesus had given the rest.
Okay.
You said Joshua.
That's what it says.
Well,
here.
and that's what New King James says, Joshua.
But it is Joshua.
Yeah.
In fact, Joshua is the Hebrew name.
For.
Jesus, Greek, I understand. That's King James. Just ask it.
No, good question. I'm glad you asked.
Context there again in terms of this talk about Joshua. Because he's one
I'm glad you asked. I forgot to run off the 10th chapter. I'll have that next week, and we'll begin with the 10th chapter next week.
You mentioned the triathlon, the events. You said it backwards.
Say what?
You said it backwards.
I did?
Yeah. They swim first, then they bike,